This is the Chronos Messenger. This is October 10th, 2022. This is the third video I am making, and it's part of a series. The object of this series is to express when the Lord is coming back and the rapture, the timing of this and sequence of these events, without using the labels that we derived from a 7-year tribulation. In other words, pre, mid, post, and so forth, because this 7-year tribulation is a false foundation. It came from Daniel chapter 9, a misinterpretation of it, and yet it has become the way to express end-time prophecy. You're either one of these views, pre, mid, post, pre-wrath, but one thing they all have in common is that their view is based on a foundation of a future 7-year tribulation. I believe that his coming and the rapture is not only a pre-wrath rapture, but it's a post-tribulation rapture, but it happens at the end of this age. It's not when the Antichrist is destroyed. That happens 3.5 years later. And when he does come at the end of the age, we are caught up to the Father's house and we stay there for the remainder of the 1,000 years, and we reign over the earth. So, and one of the things that we've seen so far is that Jesus gave us this teaching that came from the Mount of Olives just before he went to the cross. And 4 of his disciples approached him and said, "We need to understand, when will this temple be destroyed, as you said, with not one stone standing? When will that happen? And these other things. And when will you come back? What will be the sign of your coming? And the end of this age, are they the same thing? Do you come at the end of this age?" And so he cleared all of this up so beautifully, so simply. And the way he did it in the gospel accounts, and you understand that there are 3 gospels that deal with this same teaching. Matthew deals with it in Matthew 24. Mark chapter 13 reiterates the same teaching. And then Luke in chapter 21 gives us the same teaching, and some of these parts appear in other chapters, but that's principally the main teaching. So I like to say it like this. It would be beautiful if we had a DVD of Jesus teaching this subject when he sat on the Mount of Olives, but we don't. But I believe we have something even better, because we have 3 accounts of the same teaching in which the Holy Spirit led each one of the 3 to record and say it and use certain words. It didn't change the teaching. It just was another expression of it. So whereas, for instance, Matthew wrote about Great Tribulation, Mark just called it the tribulation of those days. Luke, on the other hand, called it the days of vengeance and great distress. Again, another example. Whereas Matthew and Mark wrote about the Abomination of Desolation, apparently that's maybe how Jesus said it, when you see the Abomination of Desolation. But Luke, having traveled with the Apostle Paul, the Holy Spirit led him to say it a little bit differently without disturbing the revelation, the truth of what Jesus said. And so he said it a different way. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, know that its desolation is near. That's the abomination of desolation. It's Jerusalem surrounded by armies, the Romans, which brought about this desolation to the temple that Jesus pronounced upon it. And this temple area, the Temple Mount, has been desolate for all these years. It still is to this day. So because we can put the 3 together, we have something even better than a DVD, because if we don't understand something over here that Matthew said, we can look at what Luke said, the way he said it, and because it's said at least 2 or 3 different ways, we can get a better idea of what Jesus meant and the things that he was saying. So let's take a look at what Luke said, because we have already covered a little bit of what Jesus said as it appears in Matthew and Mark. And what Jesus did in giving us the simple scenario of events, he said, here's what you do. You take a central event, this celestial sign of darkness, and I'm going to tell you what comes before it. And that is this period of Great Tribulation, or the tribulation of those days. You could also call it the beginning of sorrows or birth pains. Or like Luke, the great distress. And that period of time will be cut short by these celestial signs. And then what happens after the signs? Well, the coming of the Son of Man. Now Jesus knew Joel had already prophesied about this event, about the celestial signs of darkness, and this pivotal event that declares the end of one thing and the start of something else. He indicated that this sign of darkness in the sun, moon, and stars would announce the start of the day of the Lord. And so Jesus, knowing what Joel had said, gave us another way to say it. Whereas the signs announced the coming of the day of the Lord, he simply told us the signs in the sun, moon, and stars announce the coming of the Son of Man. So then that means that the coming of the Son of Man coincides with the coming of the day of the Lord, right? Yeah, it's simple. It's beautiful. Absolutely. Okay, can we confirm that? Is that what Luke says as well? Because some people take Luke's gospel account of this and they try to make it like it's something else other than what the other 2 gospel writers wrote about. That it doesn't. In fact, many of the Bible teachers, the pre-tribulation Bible teachers, will tell you, here's why we're so messed up, will tell you that this Olivet discourse or teaching that Jesus made on end-time prophecy doesn't even apply to the church. That he was talking, it was a message for the Jewish people in the future who would be living at the time of the Antichrist. You're like, what? The disciples came to him asking, as those who would become and start the church, what about your coming? How do you express it? We want to know about it. And you think Jesus said, well, I'll tell you, but I'll tell you what, this is not really for you. I'm going to just give you a message. It's for the Jews in the future. Now, why do we think that? Oh, because we saw the term Abomination of Desolation and our 7-year tribulation scenario that we misinterpreted and manufactured from the book of Daniel, chapter 9. We thought that the Abomination of Desolation was all about a future Antichrist because we had kicked Christ out of the prophecy, and we substituted the Antichrist in his place, saw this term and said, well, then that means this whole Olivet teaching, because of the Abomination of Desolation, has to be about a future Antichrist. It's not written to the church at all. It doesn't tell us anything about when he's coming. It has nothing to do with the rapture. That's how we presented these. No wonder we've been so confused. I mean, this stuff gets crazy. The way we twisted, added, subtracted to the Word of God until we invented a system of end-time prophecy even the scholars can't even agree on. And they debate, and there's strife, and there's this and that, and people get fed up with it. And then they say, you know what? Let's just forget the subject altogether. Let's just not talk about it because it's too complicated. It's too confusing. It just brings division. That's the state of the church here at the end of the age. Is that how it should be? Really? Well, let's take another look. We've found already in the prior videos that the Abomination of Desolation, that term was corrupted. It doesn't have anything to do with a future Antichrist. It had to do with the destruction of the Jewish temple in the siege that was from 66 AD to 70 AD, which led to this period, this desolation of the Jewish temple and the city of Jerusalem, and the dispersion of the Jewish people into captivity among the nations for a very lengthy time. That's its true definition. So the Great Tribulation is this lengthy time of some 1900 years or more of trouble. And for us, the church, it began on day one, because the word tribulation also included the idea of persecution. And so the church was persecuted from day one. And Jesus told us it's always going to be that way. You're going to be hated by all nations until the end comes, until you finish this assignment, until the end. Oh, we're going to the end of the age? Yes, you're going to be here to the end of the age. You're going to preach this gospel. Then I come. I will be with you to the end of the age. Not any longer? Well, by the end of the age, I'll come and you'll be with me. That's the beauty of it. So we have this idea that the Abomination of Desolation was an event associated with the Antichrist, so that means this whole teaching was to the Jews, not the church. Nothing could be further from the truth. How do you know that? Well, let me ask you something. Read the whole teaching. It doesn't take that long. Read it from Matthew, read it from Mark, read it from Luke. And then let me ask you, after having read it, even though he talks about false prophets, plural, and false Christs, plural, and wars and rumors of wars, plural, and famines and pestilences, earthquakes, plural, everything was plural. Do you see anything specifically in this teaching about the Antichrist? Do you see anything about him? Do you see anything in this teaching about the mark of the beast? About the image of the beast? There's false prophets mentioned, but do you see the false prophet calling fire down from? Do you see anything that we read about in the book of Revelation about this time in this Olivet teaching? Do you see the two witnesses anywhere in Jesus' teaching? Did he mention them? Do you see the fall of Mystery Babylon? Do you see anything about 7 trumpets and 7 bowls or the wrath of God? Most importantly, do you see anything about the great supper of God? So why is it that we don't see any of these things that we read about in the book of Revelation here in this Olivet teaching? Did Jesus just miss it? Did he forget? Were they not important? Or are they not there because his message is only to the church, only up to the time when he comes and we go with him back to the Father's house? When he comes in that day, when he comes after the signs and the sun, moon, and stars, when they announce the coming of the day of the Lord, is that the rapture? Yes, it is. And so that's when we go back with him to the Father's house? Absolutely. And so that's why there is no mention of these other events connected with, as we see in the book of Revelation, because they're not events associated with this age. His teaching, in other words, takes us to the end of the age and no further. So when he says that after the sun, moon, and stars and that celestial sign, then he comes, and that starts the day of the Lord. And then when he comes, he sends his angels to gather his elect from the 4 winds. That's the rapture. That's exactly what he said it is. It's him gathering his elect, his church. In the New Testament, the elect are always the church. And he's gathering us at the end of this age. It's a post-tribulation rapture, and it's a pre-wrath rapture, because the 7 trumpets and the 7 bowls of the book of Revelation and him dealing with the Antichrist, who, as we know from the other scriptures, has just invaded Israel when these signs in the sun, moon, and stars occur, when God turns out the lights just as this invasion begins. So the Antichrist was there, but he hasn't really done anything yet except start this invasion. God turns out the lights. He comes, splits the mountain, rescues the remnant in Israel by letting them flee through the mountain passage, and then he reascends together with his church to the Father's house. That's the true scenario of events. That ends this age. We judge in favor of Israel from up in the heavenly realm. We're the seated court that execute the written judgments during this times and half a time, or 3.5 year war. And the Antichrist and the false prophet are not defeated until 3.5 years later. Oh, you say, well, that's in the age to come. That's in the seventh day. Yes. We have to start thinking outside of the box. Jesus never said that by the end of this age, everything would be done and everything would be hunky-dory and we'd just have nothing else to do but sit back and sit in our chairs and relax and reign over a beautiful world. That's not the idea that the scriptures present. In fact, they tell us that when Jesus comes and takes those who are his in resurrection, that begins this 1,000-year day. And he tells us that he must reign until every enemy has been thoroughly put underfoot. It takes 1,000 years to do it. It begins by putting the first of his enemies, the Antichrist and the false prophet, and the nations that came against Israel underfoot, and restoring the kingdom to Israel so that they can reign on the earth under our jurisdiction and supervision. The concept of this last day is reigning, which means treading. Sit, the Father God said to Jesus, sit here while I make your enemies your footstool. We were given the spirit of wisdom and revelation in the knowledge of him, and it's time to put away childish things. It's time to speak of peace and be still to the stormy waves of doctrines that have tossed us to and fro like a storm. It's time for the end-time prophecy storm to be over, for a great mega peace to settle around the subject so that we can grow up into him and know what he knows. That's what this is all about. So let's wrap up this video by briefly looking at Luke's account of the Olivet teaching. And we're going to ask, does it still match the before and after paradigm that we saw in Matthew's account, where Jesus gave us the tribulation of those days, followed by the celestial signs of darkness, which then leads to the coming of the Son of Man? And does it match Joel's account or version of the same before and after paradigm, only where the celestial signs of darkness not only lead to the coming of the Son of Man, but the coming of the day of the Lord? Well, let's just check it out. Luke begins with the same scenario of persecution and being hated by all the nations and the beginning of sorrow signs, just as the other two gospel accounts do. Then, at the same point in the teaching, when Matthew and Mark refer the reader to the Abomination of Desolation, which triggers this period of Great Tribulation, Luke, on the other hand, says it like this. In verse 20 of chapter 21, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. So there's his take on the Abomination of Desolation. Rather than just state the term, he describes it or defines it for us. Thereby we know it was a first century event. Then he describes how they should depart for the mountains and so forth. And then verse 22, for these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. Then, like Matthew and Mark, he describes the woe to the pregnant women and ends by saying, for there will be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people. So we have great tribulation and the tribulation of those days in Matthew and Mark's account. Here, he just calls it great distress. It's the same thing. And then verse 24, Luke amplifies it a little bit more for us by saying they will fall by the edge of the sword, they will be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the time the Gentiles are fulfilled. That tells us or confirms that this great tribulation, this period, is a lengthy event that spans the entire church age. For we're still living in this time when, even though they've come back to their land, Jerusalem is still trodden underfoot by Gentiles. The next verse is very interesting because when Matthew and Mark then go to the celestial signs of darkness as the pivot point, as to the end of the tribulation and the start or announcing the coming of the Son of Man, Luke follows suit. Verse 25, there will be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars. Again, amplification on the earth distress of nations, with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them from the fear and the expectation of those things which are coming on the earth. What things? Well, the powers of the heavens will be shaken. That's the same thing that Matthew and Mark pointed out with respect to the shaking of the powers of the heavens. Then Luke follows the same before and after paradigm, because after the celestial signs of darkness, then what? Well, he follows the same paradigm. Verse 27, then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now, whereas Matthew and Mark then talk about the gathering of his elect by the angels, which is the rapture, Luke makes it even clearer by speaking to the church. That's why this is a message to the church, not to future Jewish people. That when these things begin to happen, look up, lift up your heads, because your redemption draws nigh. So basically, Matthew and Mark say he will send forth his angels to gather his elect. Luke says, expect to be gathered. Then he gives us a further take on this, showing that he's not only confirming what Jesus said, that the celestial signs will lead to the coming of the Son of Man, but then he confirms that it leads to the rapture, which means that the coming of the Lord is the rapture. When he comes and every eye sees him, it is when we lift up our heads and our redemption draws nigh. And if there's any doubt about it, he then confirms the whole thing. For in verse 34, take heed to yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness, the cares of this life, and that day comes on you unexpectedly. For it will come as a snare on all those who dwell on the face of the whole earth. Well, now he's confirming what Joel said. The celestial signs of darkness not only lead to the coming of the Son of Man, but to the coming of the day of the Lord. That's when he comes in that day. And if there's any doubt whatsoever, the last verse, verse 36, then puts his final seal on the revelation, which I'm sure is why God had Luke write this, well after Matthew and Mark had already contributed their gospels. For in verse 36, he says, watch therefore. He's speaking to the church. He's not speaking to Jewish believers in an Antichrist scenario. He's speaking to us who will be here when that day begins, the day of the Lord, the day we're looking for. And he says, watch therefore and pray always, that you may be counted worthy to escape all these things that will come to pass, and to stand before the Son of Man. So isn't that what the rapture is, when we escape and stand before the Son of Man? Of course it is. And this whole scenario, believe it or not, is really repeated and confirmed again in the book of Revelation in John's account, which I consider the fourth account. We see the seals and so forth, and we see the day of the Lord, and then we see the innumerable multitude in Revelation chapter 7. After the statement, the day of the Lord is come, the day of his wrath, and who can stand when he appears? And then you see this innumerable multitude standing before the throne and before the Son of Man. The elder asked the question to John, who are these? He says, I don't know, you tell me. He says, these are the ones who came out of Great Tribulation. I mean, can it be any clearer? In light of all this, do you still believe there is a secret coming in the rapture that's separate and distinct from his visible coming, which we see here? So now we are in a position to really express when the Lord is coming back. Look at the chart. Will it be a post-tribulation rapture? Well, absolutely. Because once the signs and the sun, moon, and stars announce the start of this 1,000-year day of the Lord, at that precise moment, the tribulation of those days, the Great Tribulation, has come to an immediate end. So it is post-tribulation. Is it a pre-wrath rapture? Absolutely. Because at that precise moment, the wrath of that day has not yet been poured out upon the nations. The 7 trumpets, the 7 bowls, and the Antichrist still has his 3½ years left to continue. And the great supper of God has not yet happened. That will be several years later. The beauty of what Jesus taught, what the early church understood, the easiest and best way to express it is to simply say when he comes in that day, the day of the Lord. That says it all, as long as you understand all these other terms. Then you know that that precise moment, the bridegroom comes for his bride and takes her back to his Father's house, where she will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. As for these other views, I think it's time to lay them to rest. I do not mourn their loss. I just pay my last respects. I'm thankful that they at least kept the idea of his coming before the eyes of many generations. But that's about it. After that, I basically just bow my head and say, may they rest in peace.